Thank you, everybody, for coming. I mean, this has really been an incredible 5 years, and to put on an event like this is really thanks to our staff. The commitment everyone has, and to journalism and to the community, and we really all wanted to do this. So again, my name is Tamara Chuang. I'm a reporter at the Colorado Sun. I'm one of the co-founders, and my beat, a lot of my career started as a business reporter and technology reporter. I used to cover tech at the Denver Post, and here at the Sun, I felt like there's a lot of tech coverage already. I mean, why would you look to the Sun for that? And we didn't have a large staff, so I started doing more business and economy stories, especially during the pandemic. Ended up trying to help a lot of the people who were unemployed or struggling, and ended up starting the What's Working column that runs every Saturday. And it's free, so if you guys don't know about that, please sign up. You'll get it right in your inbox. But one of the great things about covering the economy and the state on the business side is meeting someone like Elizabeth Garner, who is the state demographer. She is a whiz with data. She's been at the office for 19 years, and the state demographer for 19 years. I pitched her to my team as a session that we really needed to share with our readers and the community, because Elizabeth gives these great presentations, but I often feel like they're to a business audience or a company or something like that, but I don't know if she really gets an opportunity to talk to just people who live here in her community. So my idea got passed, and we are both here. And it is my pleasure to welcome Elizabeth Garner. She's going to start with a presentation about Colorado's demographics. If you guys have a question, after she presents, I'm going to be talking to her, discussing and asking her a few more questions. But we are taking some reader questions, so if you do have one, Sandra Fish, who is right over there, she covers politics for us. She let's see, did you hand out note cards for them? Okay, note cards, or you can ask in the app if you guys figured out how to use that. And we'll see how it goes.
Raise your hand and I'll come around to you.
We may need a cue when it's time to go, but hopefully you guys will really get something out of this. I think we'll run the slide later, but I know we're getting support from AARP and a bunch of other sponsors, and I'm sorry I don't remember them all, but oh, there we go. So please welcome Elizabeth Garner, Colorado State Demographer.
All righty. Well, thank you guys so much for being here today, and thank you, Tamara, for the invitation to be here. It's, I've always been a smidge nervous talking to media, right? Because it's not always an easy conversation, and I have to admit, I reached out to Tamara several times over the last several years saying, well, I think that your lens on what you reported is an interesting lens, but I have a different lens. And so she was so open to conversation, really talking about the data that she was seeing, what her interpretation was, and my view of the data and what my interpretation was. And I think that this is really, really helpful to be able to have the conversations, and especially with media, because I think media plays an important role, right, in the state and in communicating sometimes some really complex concepts. And their role is to do it actually in a really easy to understand format. So today, we're going to actually spend a lot more time just having a conversation and answering questions. I'm going to set the stage initially with just some general information so that when you ask some questions, you've got a little bit of foundation for where they're coming from. I do want you guys to know the State Demography Office is in the Department of Local Affairs. We've existed since in the mid-1980s. We're in statute. We're independent we're not a governor's office. We're obviously in the cabinet, but we're not in the governor's office, so we're independent. And we were created so that we could create independent population estimates and forecasts for state agencies and local governments to use primarily for program planning. Because imagine if Department of Transportation, Department of Human Services, Department of Corrections were all doing their independent forecasts and estimates. You'd have as many entities out there. So one entity doing it that has no agenda. I mean, our agenda is just to try and get it as right as possible. Not to, I'm not running a program, right, that I need certain estimates or forecasts for. So that's why we were created and that's why we exist. If you see right there, the website, demography.dola.colorado.gov, it is sweet. Check it out, and especially if you're a nerd. It's really, we try and create the data and information for people to use as they are able. So we've got sometimes just a bunch of pictures, right? Some people just like pictures. We've got stories. We've got data downloads. So wherever you are, we try and help. And if you don't like the format that it's in, please contact us. 95% of the apps and tools we've created is because somebody has said, hey, Elizabeth, I would really like to look at this plus this. So, that's how we come up. I mean, because again, we're nerds. We'll just put data tables out there. But if you ask and you say, hey, we'd like to see something this direction, we will try and accommodate, because if you've got that question, most likely like a gazillion other people have that same question. So with that, we're going to hit the first slide. And you're thinking, I hope she's not in charge of the visuals for her office, right? You've got kind of three crazy lines here, but I wanted to set the stage in that Colorado's total population right now is about 5.8 million people. We grow or change based on only three variables: births, deaths, and net migration. On this chart, we're starting back in 1970, and I always recommend people do a long time trend when they're looking at something so that they can see perspectives. And the first thing I want to talk about are births. Births are the blue line, and you'll see that births are actually the largest contributor to population growth in the state. So when I get complaints or I see things in media where people say, oh my God, we just don't need any more people, I'm like, all right, well, these are babies. They are not that bad. But it's important to see that, and important to see that the solid line is current population, the dashed line is forecast. We've seen births fall, and probably everybody's heard about that in the state, right? Births are down about 8,000 fewer births per year today than our peak in 2007. For the United States as a whole, births are down about 625,000 fewer births per year than the peak in 2007. That's created, for the United States as a whole, an absolute decline in the under 18 population by over 1 million. So the takeaway from this is births are down, fewer kiddos. So when you hear Jeffco, Denver, other school districts having to close schools, it's simply because births are down. But you can also see that we're forecasting births to get back at those previous levels in the future. Why? Because we are forecasting on the green continued net migration. Now you can see the net migration numbers go all over the place. And if you remember your history, you can kind of calculate in there the booms and busts in Colorado's history. Anybody remember the glorious 80s? We had the savings and loan bust, the oil and gas bust. We had 5 years of net out migration in the state, and you can see that in that late 80s, which, prices were super depressed, and Colorado became a bargain. And so we see the 90s, we saw more of a boom in that net migration. But also a lot of other things were happening globally as well as in the country that led to a lot of that growth in that net migration. But what's funny is you can see when you see that peak in that net migration in the 90s, just a couple of years later, what do you see? You see a little bit of a boom in the babies. Why? Because when we attract people to Colorado, we attract youngins, young adults. And what do young adults do? They find other young adults and they procreate, right? And so we can watch that over time and see those implications. So we are forecasting net migration to return to pre-pandemic levels in the short run. Why? Because we're aging. And I'm going to explain that in a little bit. Deaths we're seeing increase. Why? Because we've got a larger share of our population in age groups that have higher death rates. That's all there is to it. You can see the spike from COVID, but we are forecasting things to get back onto trajectory. So I think I've hit everything on that slide. Next slide. So if you take all that information, then it's a little bit more fun to look at this. These bars show population change over time. As, again, starts in 1970. The red is net migration. The blue is called natural increase, births minus deaths. We can see, like I said, the different implications from the booms and busts, and remember, a lot of those were driven by job growth. Okay, so big takeaway is we see jobs fall, we see net out migration, we see jobs grow, we see net in migration. On the blue line, again, we'll see that we peaked in our natural increase in 2007, and I don't think we'll ever get back to that level again of natural increase. I think where we are on that trajectory is about where we'll be simply because of the change in births and deaths. What you will see is on that far right-hand side, the significant slowdown in growth. Over our last decade, between 2010 and 2020, Colorado increased by about 744,000 people over the decade. That means about 74,000 people a year. So if you take that 744 divided by 10. The last 2 years, our growth is right around 27,000. So about a third of what we saw as our annual average over the last decade. And again, from all three reasons, deaths up, births down, net migration slowing. Next slide. So this is the way that I think about my life and my world. Supply and demand. I can't help it. It really is an idea that we see that jobs grow, or we see jobs as a demand for people. So we run two models, not only, really looking at our future, but this really also explains our past. So we look at jobs. We look at the jobs in the United States. We look at how Colorado fits into the US picture. And that creates a demand for labor, a demand for workers. Then on the supply side, we just take our total population. We look at you by single year of age, and we apply birth and death rates, as well as labor force participation rates by all of those different dynamics. And that is our potential supply of workers. So we've got our demand for workers and our supply for workers. And where they don't equal each other, then comes into play net migration. Next slide. And we can see how this operates over time. This starts back in 1990, right? 80, sorry, I can only see from this direction. And the blue bars are job growth, and the red line is net migration. And we can see over time, when we had stronger job growth, we had stronger net migration. When we have weaker job growth, we have weaker net migration. And I say that out loud, and you're like, duh, Elizabeth. I mean, I know it's a Friday morning, but I get it. But I will tell you, a lot of people don't. Right? A lot of people are like, Elizabeth, I'm not a fan of people. And I'm like, all right, I get it. And I ask them, what's the issue? And they're like, they're on the roads. They're in our houses. They're on the ski slopes. And I'm like, all right. I'm like, but tell me what you think about jobs. And the first thing they'll say is, jobs rock. And we need more jobs. Job growth, good. I'm like, all right, but go with me on this. A job is a person, and a housing unit is where that job sleeps at night. You cannot be pro-jobs and anti-people, right? And you're like thinking to yourself, that's not a lot of work she has to do. And it's true, it's not rocket science. But it's important to understand that relationship. Certainly, yes, people migrate for no job sometimes, but really, when we migrate people to the state, we migrate young adults. 22 to 37 is our bread and butter. We don't attract a lot of older adults like a Florida or an Arizona. It is that primary working age population that we migrate to the state. And those flows can be pretty significant, over 130,000 a year in and 110,000 out. It fluctuates over time, but it's important to understand that role. The other thing that you'll see on this is that we're forecasting things to slow down. Really, after the 2025 bar looks big, it is really taking into account the recovery from COVID. So all of the jobs, we lost like 360,000 jobs in the matter of like 2 months. And so that's showing that recovery component, plus job growth over the next couple of years. But then we're forecasting job growth to slow down. Why? Because it's slowing down in the US. And then we're also forecasting net migration to slow down. Why? Because there's actually going to be fewer people to attract. Again, what did I say about births? Births are down. We're going to have to compete even harder for the best and the brightest. And not just retain, not even just attract. Remember, retain. We've got plenty of folks leaving the state as well. You'll also see that our net migration number is higher than our job forecast. Why? Because we're aging. I'm going to age out of the labor force, God willing, this decade, Paris stay solvent, and somebody needs to take my job, right? At the same time, we're creating new jobs every year. Like this year, I think the estimate or forecast is about 53,000, 54,000 new jobs this year. We've got about 40,000 people retiring a year. That creates a demand, right, for about 90, 95,000 people to fill jobs. Well, we don't have all of those people here locally to fill all of those jobs. So that's why we migrate people to fill them. Next slide. So this is our Colorado's age distribution, broken down by single year of age and generation. On that far right side, our silent generation, followed by our boomers, our Gen X, then our millennials in the red, our Gen Z in the blue, and then our Gen Alpha in the brown. A couple of things that I'll highlight is the black line is at 65, just to give you some perspective of where we are. Our peak person's about 30, and then you can really see the slowdown on that left-hand side. So for example, there are fewer 0-year-olds than there are 60-year-olds. So we definitely see that slowdown on that young end. I would say my most favorite variable to ever watch is age. Why? because everything changes by age. What we want, how we want it, where we want it, how much money we have for it, how likely we are to participate in the labor force, what kind of housing demands we want, are all based on age. So understanding what this is going to do in terms of growth to consumer demand, demand for services, likelihood to participate in the labor force, is significant. So really the idea behind this is age groups kind of left of 30 or younger than 30 will continue to see a slowdown. Age groups on the right of 30 will see an increase, and this has implications for the state. Next slide. So over the next decade, we're forecast to increase by about 60,000 people, about 600,000 people, but absolute decline in the under 18. Very flat growth in the 18 to 24-year-olds. Some growth in the 25 to 44 if we can migrate and attract and retain people here to fill jobs. Pretty flat on the 45 to 64 because we've got the Gen X coming into that after the baby boomers. But then if you look at the 65 plus, we're forecasting almost 50% of our total growth over the next decade will be our 65 plus population. And you're like, wait, Elizabeth, where are they coming from? I'm like, look in a mirror. Right? It's just people like me aging in place. That is creating the growth in our older adult population. It's close to very net zero in terms of, yes, you'll know people that move here, but yes, there's also people that leave. But again, this has huge implications on consumer demand, demand for services, labor force, housing. For example, I said, I'm hoping that I age out over this decade, but I'm not leaving my house. My house used to house 4 people. Now it houses 2 people because I've got 2 launched. Yay! Somebody said still hold space for them. We have 2 workers, so that house provides services to 2 workers. But over this decade, we're hoping 0 workers. And guess what? I'm not going anywhere. Next state demographer is not living in my house. So this, you'll hear there's other sessions today that talk about housing. Not only was there a supply-demand challenge, but there's also an aging challenge. We have never seen this growth in the older adult population, and using housing just as a resident, not as where a worker lives, is a dynamic that's different and changing. Next slide. It also impacts the labor force. I don't really expect you to read this and look at it. I just wanted you to see the pretty shapes. I think of labor force participation rates by age as a rainbow, right? The 2 ends have the lowest labor force participation. We've got males on the left and females on the right. The young ends are like the 16 to 19-year-olds are the far left on the brown color. And then our 75 plus are kind of that black color on the far right of each rainbow. They have the lowest labor force participation rates. And you're like, duh, right? People retire and people aren't entered yet. Then our prime working age populations are in that kind of 35 to 54-year-olds. So you've heard this. We've got slow growth aging into the labor force. We've got fast growth aging out of the labor force. Fast growth aging into the lowest labor force participation rates. This will have an impact on the labor force. You've already felt it. This is why it's tight. We, last decade, had about 500,000 people age out of the labor force. This decade, we're expecting 400,000 people to age out of the labor force. Even though we've seen labor force participation rates for the older adults increasing over time, doubling. Even just from 2010 to 2020, increased from 10% to 20%. And I think there's even forecast to increase higher over this next decade. But even with that, it's creating a tight labor force. Next slide. And on this, I just want you to see the dark green line is the share or the total number of people in our labor force that are 55 plus. It has been by far the fastest growing age group in our labor force. So important to understand this dynamic and this change as well. Next slide. I won't take a ton of time. I just want you to see the picture again. Housing has been a challenge. I mentioned it earlier. Housing is a challenge. On this graph, we've got the orange line, or housing growth. The blue line is household population, so people that would live in a housing unit. Anybody in the construction industry, residential construction industry here? Okay. And you can probably testify, it's a boom and bust industry. And we can see it over time. In the 80s, it busted. Then in the 90s, it boomed. Then in the 2000s, it busted. During the Great Recession, we lost over 70,000 jobs just in construction. Firms went under, left and right. Supply chains crumbled. For 10 years, we did not build what we needed to build because that industry had collapsed. Financing had gone away. Like I said, supply chains, labor force, all pretty destroyed during the Great Recession. But our population kept growing. That creates a problem, right? So we see increased demand, lack of supply. What did that do to price? Right through the roof. Fortunately, if you can see on that far right-hand side, we're finally back at production levels since about 2018. Population is slowing down, so we're starting to make ground in creating that additional supply of housing that we need for our population. Next slide. So I'm tying it up. This is what I want you to walk away with before we start chit-chatting. Jobs drive migration. I hear people mention it all the time. We don't like people. I'm like, so you have to think about what jobs are you willing to do without if you don't like people. And the demand for people for jobs is not just new jobs, but old jobs like mine. So retirements plus new jobs, and then this weird remote worker, right? The one that has the job in Boston but lives in Denver. We have to take that into account as well. Population growth is slowing, as I mentioned before, but it's still growing. Slowing because we're seeing a slowdown in births, slowdown in net migration, and an increase in deaths. Aging is significant. It's probably the biggest transition in our state. We've never had a larger share of our population in older age groups. So this is new. And that's something that we're going to have to manage as well, is that change in the population. And what that means to migration in terms of driving job demand, driving the economy in terms of demands from the economy. Some people will say, oh, Elizabeth, we just won't do any job growth. I'm like, yeah, tell my mom that needs the home health aide. I mean, there are some jobs that just will grow because we're here. A lot of them in the health service sector. And there's a ton of uncertainties in this forecast, and I'm sure you guys will ask these questions. I'm sure Tamara will bring them up as well. But what about water? What about the booms and busts? What about recessions? What about natural disasters? How does that impact change? You're right. If I knew all that, do you think I'd work for the state? Right? I'd have a cool job. Next slide. So what are we forecasting? We are forecasting in that light blue, 600,000 this decade, 600,000 the next decade, followed about 400,000. Primarily driven simply by age and job growth. Slower, though, than the last 30 years. The last 30 years, we increased by about 2.4 million. The The next 30 years, we're forecasting to increase by about 1.7 million. So all of you, most of you, maybe none of you, would say, but that's still a lot of people. I'm like, absolutely, that's right. About 40% of it are people over the age of 65, which is a new dynamic for Colorado. So non-workers. Yeah, I'm hoping to be in that group, right? That's why I've been doing this for 40 years, working so I can not work. But just keep all of these in mind. And I think with that, let's see, next slide, should be that. Remember, I work for the state of Colorado. I am paid for by your taxpayer dollars. Visit our website, give me a call, and let me know what kind of questions you have, what kind of data needs you've got for whatever you might be dealing with. With that, Tamara, are we ready?
We're ready. Again, if you do have a question, let Sandra Fish know. Try to type it in, and she'll bring them to me. But I'm just going to start with a few of my own. I talk. Oh, use the mic. Is this on? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, you got one. Well, I'm gonna start with questions, and just with the name of what we titled this, I wanted to make sure people understood the whole population, from babies to the boomers and the ones who really kept us going and stuff. And Elizabeth doesn't do policy, but I think a lot of policy is based on her work. And every month I cover the workforce, like how our jobs have grown or not grown or whatever. And every month the state labor department tells me we have a really high labor force participation rate. That means like close to 70%, I think it was like 68% of adults 16 and over work or are looking for work. So, unemployed or they're looking. And every month they're saying, we're one of the highest. It's so great. And then I talked to Elizabeth and it's like, well, we used to be much higher. I think in the early 2000s, it was in the mid 70% of all adult Coloradans were working here. And now we're about 68 or 69. I see Bill back there. He probably knows that off the top of his head. So it made me wonder, well, what about, how do policies change our population and the labor force? In the past year, we've had Roe v. Wade, right? That changed, that policy changed people's feelings about where they live. There's just been a lot of other things that have happened. And so, my question, Elizabeth, and we sort of talked about this already, was, when could we ever change the trajectory of what you were showing up there? If people started having 5 kids.
That would change things.
But I think what you were telling me was it's really, our future is based on net migration. So, policy-wide, like when Colorado legalized marijuana, I mean, what impact did that have to to Colorado's population? Or, did we see anything in the past few years because of all the gender politics and, Roe v. Wade?
Right. No, really good questions, right? The one that we can definitely at least see was the marijuana. Because if you guys remember when it was passed, we were only one of 2 states. And we did see a spike in net migration that year. But I will also tell you that it was highly driven also by job growth in the marijuana industry that year as well. So policy for sure, but also still ultimately connected to job growth. I think it's maybe too early to tell, like with Roe v. Wade, changes on how that will impact Colorado. I don't think we've been able to necessarily pick it up yet in the data in the next couple of years. I think we will, but people, what we like to say is people vote with their feet. They pick a place, even within the state, that fits their needs, their combination of amenities, maybe politics, maybe tax rates, maybe school districts. You have a choice, right? You can live where you want. And so even when we're looking at, are there ways to decrease commute times or decrease commuting, I was like, all right, but wait a minute, remember preferences. They may prefer to live in Dougco, but their job is in Denver, and it doesn't matter how many housing units you build in Denver, they're gonna live in Dougco. And, other folks will look at me like, you're crazy, and I'm like, no, I'm not. We can see it. We see it over time that people have preferences. I think big picture, you can definitely look at policies across the globe related to migration and family. Canada, for example, has a very strategic international migration policy, attracting workers of exactly the kind they want to their country as a labor force, because they're seeing the same thing that the United States is seeing. So I think you can be strategic in your migration policies. Likewise, there's some countries, also Canada, that have some very family-friendly policies, making it easier for families and women to have kids. I mean, the one thing that we didn't forecast was this significant decline in birth rates. Our total fertility rate now is 1.5. In Colorado, it's 1.6. In the United States, total replacement is 2.1. So we are significantly below replacement in Colorado and in the United States. And some of it is complete choice, but some of it is also because people are like, oh, it's kind of expensive to do that. And yeah, so could we make it easier for families? Probably. Even, like I struggle, I provide care to my mom, and she's an aging adult, but she needs to go to doctors' offices and stuff like that. Fortunately, I've got a very flexible employer that, if I take her to the doctor during the day, I can work at night, those kinds of things to make up my time. But does everybody have that option? Or do they have to leave the labor force to care for either for children or for aging adults? So definitely policies have an impact.
Right, and actually, I mean, if you all know, some of the policies in Colorado recently are the family leave. So next year, I mean, the state started collecting money this year to build up this fund, and starting January 1st, that's when people who don't have family leave can take time to have a baby and get partially paid, not just from this bank. It's kind of like the unemployment insurance trust fund. But policies like that, I think, is what has resulted in trying to make Colorado more amenable to net migration, I guess, and people who want to stay here. We're getting a lot of good questions from readers, so I'm probably going to just skip mine. But here's one. What are cities doing to keep up with these changing demographics?
So one thing, because I didn't show a map of the state, I think one important thing to understand is that not every place in the state is growing. We've got about 25% of our counties are declining in population. And so a lot of places, we focus a lot on the Front Range because a lot of us are from the Front Range, and we think about growth and how hard it is to manage growth. But then you also have to understand, how hard is it to manage decline? When you've got a smaller tax base, fewer resources to still fund, you still need the roads, the bridges, the schools, the libraries. And so a lot of different communities are looking at strategies to, bring in workers to help provide a workforce. They're thinking about different businesses that can come in to help provide jobs to support people staying. So I think there's a lot of communities thinking about both sides. What are the challenges of a lot of growth? What are some of the challenges of not very many people? And thinking about those two sides. But I think as a public, it's important to understand that we've got these two sides, so that we're understanding what, like the Eastern Plains, San Luis Valley, some of the northwest part of the state is going through in terms of population change.
I've actually got a follow-up on my own to that question. A lot of, broadband is getting a lot of funding this year and for the next few years in Colorado. I believe the state got about $500 million to $700 million just in grants to help build out fast internet to rural areas especially. So I know a lot of these smaller communities that may see population declines probably, have already latched onto that. But so how does that work? If people are moving from Denver to a smaller community out in the mountains, is that net migration for that community, but then that's a positive for that community, but Denver loses people? And how do you guys balance that out, or does it not really matter?
Oh, no, it matters.
Okay.
We follow it all of the time. The county-to-county flows. And this happens. This is very, very normal. People, and especially from out of town, will land in Denver first and then pick a place that they want to go to. Or, like, somebody will be in Denver forever and decide to go somewhere else. And we'll pick that up in the net migration numbers through IRS records. So it will show, like, you paid your taxes in Denver, and then you went and you paid your taxes in Pueblo, for example. And that's how that migration component is picked up. Broadband or other things like that is a great way to create access, right? Because that's what we're wanting to do, is level the playing field, create more access. And so a lot of smaller communities, and especially more of the rural areas, are looking at what are some opportunities for that location neutral person from a lot of different angles. Is your job in Denver, but you're living in Lamar? So you're taking that Denver wage to Lamar, and that's kind of a boom for them, and they can spend those dollars then locally. Or let's say you're a couple and only one of you can find a job in Lamar, and then the other person can find a remote job. So there's a lot of opportunities from looking at broadband or other access. But what I also tell communities is beware, right? I'm working with one mountain county, and for a decade or so, they've been looking at trying to attract remote workers because all they had were a lot of tourism jobs. So they've been successful, and they have an even worse housing problem, right? Because you bring in those dollars from outside, it's higher than the tourism jobs that are local. They didn't plan necessarily ahead for that extra demand, and it's a bummer. So we like people to try and plan.
Yeah, I think I hear that a lot. Another questions, a few questions are around immigration policy and stuff. And first of all, one question was, how do you count undocumented immigrants? They're part of the population count, right?
Right. So in terms of the undocumented, the name speaks for itself. They're undocumented, and so it's really hard to use like IRS records or anything like that to necessarily pick them up. What we're hoping is that during each decennial count, it's a count of the entire population regardless of citizenship status. We'll use that as the base, and then we move from there. If sometimes there are documents that will show up in that net migration number that we get from the Census Bureau that will pick them up, but I am guessing that we're going to also miss a large share of the undocumented, and it's also sometimes really hard because they tend to have mixed status within a family. Like there might be, one partner is a citizen, the other is not a citizen, and then they'll have kids that are citizens. So it's hard. We try our best.
Well, with immigration policies, though, I'm always kind of shocked at how much our future relies on net migration to keep our state growing. But with immigration, that's been in a lot of news actually for decades, right? But what about the impact of immigration what's the impact immigration could have on Colorado's population, instead of excluding net migration from other states? How do you count that?
The international migration?
Yes. I mean,
the legal international.
Has that been a big
that it is
impact in the past, and could it be in the future?
So Colorado's total net migration for any year, about 20% of it tends to be international. So during COVID, the reason why we really saw a lot of that net migration dip is because of, all of those borders were closed. People couldn't leave, people couldn't come. So we did see net migration fall for the entire United States as well as then for Colorado. Like you kind of referred, we don't have an international net migration policy, right? And it's hard, right? Because again, people I hate people. And it doesn't matter where they're from, right? Just that I hate people. And so it's been really hard for any politician, right, to manage that international migration policy for the country as a whole. I think we could be strategic. But what I also like to say is if then. I'm not necessarily super positive on pop growth or super negative on pop growth. What I want people to understand is the if then. If we don't have any international migration, we will decline in total population. Now, some of you would say, hooray. And then I would also say, what services are you willing to do without? Which is okay too. So that's an if then. During the 90s, we had a lot of international migration, primarily supporting a lot of the construction industries. And that's what really created, that big spike you saw in that, the net migration. Almost half of it was international to support our construction industry, building housing units that we needed to live in. But if they stay, which not everybody does, then they have kids, and then that creates the supply of people over time. So then that's another if then. So if we have international migration, then we'll also need houses and also, need to think about that population change. But the U.S. is also not always the location of choice for a lot of people. We're also seeing slowing down growth in Central and South America is starting to slow down. So we're actually seeing Asia as a larger donor for our net international migration. It'll be interesting to see with time what our policies end up being.
Another thing about migration that we talked about was, I mentioned, our population's getting older. People are living longer, people are working longer, but are the people moving here, are they getting older too? Can we expand that age base? But I think you said no. Most people who move here are certain ages. So it's what do we do with that information? So when younger people, and what age
22 to 37.
22 to 37 is like the average person who moves to Colorado, and that's the group we are relying on. So, and that's been consistent for decades.
Decades.
Which to me is just amazing. It's like, how can it be so much the same for so many decades, so many years and stuff? So, but when that happens, why can't we attract older people? Or, why, what do we need to make sure we keep these 22 to 37-year-olds moving here?
So Colorado is a regional center in the Rocky Mountain West. We've been very fortunate over the decades that we are a hub. And so we attract people looking for opportunities. And we've had opportunities. Colorado's had a faster job growth than the rest of the country for several years and decades historically. And so we've seen that expansion and people have come here. But we're nowhere near like Texas, right? So we increased by 26,000 people, about half and half from natural increase, half from net migration this last year. Texas increased by 300,000. 300,000. So we need to remember that we're competing, right, for the best and the brightest. Colorado's always been able to compete for the best and the brightest, except recently, right? So that drop in that net migration was also an indicator. Colorado's gotten really expensive. So I think that is a concern, is wondering, will people choose to come to Colorado? Sure, it's still beautiful. The mountains are still beautiful. They're still there. But can we attract and retain? Can we compete for the best and the brightest? And I do think I think we should plan for both sides. What if we do? What if we don't? Right now, and Tamara was kind of referring to it, there's this ratio of job openings to unemployed, and that's kind of a ratio that's used nationally. Colorado's job openings to unemployment is 2.1 to 1. So there's 2.1 job openings to every one unemployed. For the nation as a whole, it's 1.5 job openings to every one. So we've got this higher ratio, but we're having a hard time attracting and retaining. And I think a lot of it has to do with price point. Now, we're definitely lower cost than both coasts, and that's where we're attracting people from. They come here, and they look at our housing, and they're like, that's affordable housing. And they look at our traffic, and they're like, this isn't traffic. So always remember, other people have other lenses for what they see. But I do think that we have to be cautious and aware that we may see a different future than we currently have. I doubt we'll see this big net in of older adults. We're not an Arizona or a Florida. And tax policy also plays into that. A lot of folks move to places that have different tax policies.
Well, we've got to wrap up, but I'm going to end with one reader question that I think is a good one to end with. What's the biggest source of uncertainty in your forecast?
So I kind of listed some of the uncertainties on that list. I think like international migration is one of the biggest ones. I think hands down is going to be one of the biggest uncertainties. But also I want to bring up just water, right? And I think there's a water session maybe today. Mm-hmm. Water's a big uncertainty, right? Because that will impact the price of everything. So as the demand increases, supply is diminished. That pushes price up, and it could be then even more expensive to put in housing for firms to operate, and so that would have a limiting factor on who we are. I think those are probably the two biggest ones that are in my mind.
Elizabeth, thank you so much.
You are quite welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone. It's about 10 o'clock, so I think we are supposed to go to another session or something like that. If you didn't get your questions answered, oh, okay. You had, Elizabeth had put her email up there. You can always reach me as well, tamara@coloradosun.com. I am probably going to be downstairs at the registration table. Come say hi if you read my stuff. If you have criticism, I love talking to people. I try to respond to people. And thank you so much. If you need, and also if you need to know where to go, let me know. I think I might know.